In the autumn of 1891, in the hardscrabble Montana Territory, the settlers of Elkhorn Valley watched a woman engaged in what looked like madness. Her name was Bridget Callahan. She was 34 years old, born in County Cork, raised in the tin mining villages of Cornwall, widowed in the copper pits of Pennsylvania. She had a face weathered beyond her years, hands calloused from work that never ended, and eyes the color of slate that revealed nothing of what moved behind them. While other homesteaders were felling the last timber of the season and chinking their cabins against the coming winter, Bridget Callahan was hauling perfectly good lumber up the steep northern slope of the valley. She was hauling it into the dark, yawning mouth of the old Silver Crown mine, an abandoned 11 years prior when the silver played out and the company men moved on to richer ground. She was not clearing the mine. She was not salvaging what remained. She was building inside it. From the valley floor, the townspeople could watch her silhouette against the sky, a small figure wrestling beams and planks into the earth's gullet. She worked from dawn until the last light failed, a methodical and relentless pace that seemed to have no audience but the circling hawks, the whispering pines, and the copper-colored dog that never left her side. The work was slow, it was arduous, and to every practical mind in Elkhorn Valley, it was utterly insane. "That woman is building her own coffin," muttered Garrett Holloway at the trading post one October morning. He stood by the potbelly stove, in warming hands that had built 52 cabins in 35 years. "She is digging a grave for herself and that boy." The sentiment rippled through the small community and hardened into accepted fact. The project earned a name, as such follies often do. They called it the Callahan Coffin, a grim joke whispered over fence posts and mugs of weak coffee. Her son Cormac was 9 years old, small for his age, with his dead father's blue eyes and his mother's stubborn silence. He was seen helping her each day, his thin arms struggling with loads too heavy for a child. This transformed the community's judgment from mockery to something darker, a pitying, righteous concern. The woman was not merely a fool, she was a fool endangering her child. What did this quiet outsider, this widow from distant lands, understand about survival that every seasoned pioneer and builder in the valley had supposedly missed? What secret did she believe was buried in that cold, dead rock? The answer would be delivered by the cruelest winter in living memory, a trial of ice and wind that would test every assumption and break every tradition the valley held dear. But that winter had not yet arrived, and the woman kept building. Before we continue with what happens next, I want to pause for just a moment. This story of Bridget Callahan is going to take us through one of the most brutal winters in Montana history. But first, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Drop a comment below and tell me your location. I read every single comment, and it means more than you know to hear from all of you around the world. Now, let us return to Elkhorn Valley and see what drove Bridget to build inside a mountain. To understand what Bridget Callahan was trying to do, you must first understand the problem she was trying to solve. Winter in the Montana Territory was not a season, it was a predator. It stalked the valleys from late October and did not release its grip until April. The cold was a physical presence, a thing with weight and malice. It was a dry, searing cold that cracked timber and split skin, driven by winds that the settlers called the barber, for how they seemed to shave the warmth from a man's very bones. Survival was measured in two things: the height of your woodpile and the quality of your cabin. The conventional wisdom, brought west from the forests of Ohio and Pennsylvania, was clear and absolute. A proper cabin was built from thick interlocking logs, the gaps stuffed tight with a mixture of mud, moss, and horsehair. It had a massive stone fireplace at one end, a roaring hearth that was the symbolic and literal heart of the home. A well-built cabin, the old-timers said, could withstand anything the land could throw at it. This was a lie, a comforting, traditional, and deadly lie. Bridget Callahan knew it was a lie because she had spent the previous winter, her first in the valley, renting a small and expertly built cabin from Garrett Holloway himself. She had watched the truth of the cold with the dispassionate eye of someone who had learned to observe before she learned to speak. She saw how the great stone fireplace, for all its cheerful blaze, was a deeply inefficient machine. It consumed cords of wood at a terrifying rate, but most of the heat went straight up the chimney, pulling the precious warm air from the cabin with it. She observed the physics of failure firsthand. She saw how frost formed on the heads of the nails driven into the interior walls. Perfect white stars marking the pathways where the cold was infiltrating her home. She watched herself stuff rags into the gaps around the window frames, a futile battle against the relentless siege of the wind. She felt the drafts that snaked across the floor, chilling feet and stealing body heat. The family lived their lives in a small semicircle around the fire, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of bitter cold. To move more than 10 feet from the hearth was to enter another climate entirely. Bridget's son Cormac caught a fever that winter. For 3 weeks she sat beside his bed, feeding the fire around the clock, watching her woodpile dwindle while her child shivered under every blanket she owned. He survived, but the memory of those weeks carved itself into her heart like a wound that would never fully heal. She would not spend another winter that way. She would not watch her son shiver in a cabin that everyone said was properly built. She would not trust the conventional wisdom that had nearly killed him. She would build something different, something that actually worked. But before she could begin, she had to survive a different kind of threat. 3 weeks after she started surveying the Silver Crown mine, Bridget received a summons. Not a formal legal document, but something almost worse. A polite invitation to attend a meeting at the Methodist Church, signed by Reverend Josiah Crane. She knew what it meant. When the whole valley had been watching her climb that mountain, the whole valley had been whispering. The meeting took place on a Tuesday afternoon in early September. Bridget sat alone on a wooden pew while 4 men arranged themselves behind a table at the front of the church. Reverend Crane in the center, his thin face arranged in an expression of pastoral concern. Garrett Holloway to his right, arms crossed, jaw set. Silas Decker, the storekeeper, to the left, unable to meet her eyes. And Dr. Ezra Whitfield at the end, a man who had examined her for fever once and now apparently felt qualified to examine her mind. Mrs. Callahan, the Reverend began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man delivering difficult news. We have asked you here out of Christian concern. You are a widow. You are alone. Like you have a young son who depends upon you entirely, and we have observed you engaged in activities that trouble us. Bridget said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was often the strongest response. Garrett Holloway leaned forward. You are building something in that mine, something no one has ever seen. You are spending money you cannot afford on materials for a project that cannot work. And you are taking your boy up there with you, day after day, into a place that is dangerous and unstable. It is not unstable, Bridget said quietly. I have surveyed every inch of that chamber. You are not an engineer, Dr. Whitfield interjected. You are a grieving widow. It is understandable that grief might affect your judgment, might lead you to unusual decisions. The implication hung in the air like smoke. What are you suggesting? Bridget asked. Reverend Crane spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. We are suggesting that perhaps young Cormac would benefit from staying with a stable family for the winter. The Hendersons have offered to take him in. He would be warm, well-fed, safe, and you would have time to reconsider your plans, to grieve properly, to heal. Bridget felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear, recognition. She understood exactly what was happening. You want to take my son. We want to protect him, Silas Decker said, still not meeting her eyes. Mrs. Callahan, I have watched you buy supplies. Stovepipe, lumber, hardware. None of it makes sense for any structure I know. If that project fails, if you get trapped up there when winter comes, the boy would be orphaned. Is that what you want? Holloway finished. Well, to leave him alone in the world because you were too proud to listen to reason? Bridget stood. She looked at each of them in turn. The minister who wrapped control in the language of compassion, the builder who could not imagine being wrong, the shopkeeper who would not meet her eyes, the doctor who had diagnosed her sanity from across a room. I have 8 weeks before winter arrives, she said. Her voice was steady. If my project fails, if I cannot keep my son warm and safe, I will bring him down myself. But I will not hand him over to strangers because you are afraid of something you do not understand. She walked to the door of the church. Then she paused and looked back. My husband died trying to save 13 men. He succeeded. He gave his life for people who would have died without him. I will not fail my son. Aaron, and I will not fail my husband's memory. She left the church and walked back toward the mountain. Behind her, the four men exchanged glances. They had given her 8 weeks. They were certain it would not be enough. Bridget had not always been alone. She had been married for 11 years to a man named Declan Callahan, a miner from County Cork, who had immigrated to America with dreams of something better than the coal pits of his father and grandfather. Declan had found work in the copper mines of Pennsylvania, and there he had discovered something unexpected. He had discovered that he understood the earth. Not in the mystical way of fortune tellers and water witchers. Declan understood the earth the way an engineer understands a machine. He studied the movement of air through tunnels. He measured temperatures at different depths. He filled leather-bound notebooks with observations and calculations, teaching himself the physics that formal schools had never offered him. In the mines, Declan had learned truths that surface dwellers never considered. He learned that just a few dozen feet below the frost-covered ground, the earth maintained a steady, constant temperature, around 54 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. It did not matter if the sun baked the surface in summer or if a blizzard raged in winter. The deep earth was stable, unchanging, a massive planetary reservoir of thermal energy that most people walked over every day without ever thinking about. He also understood air. He knew how it moved, how it carried heat, how it could be managed and directed. In the mines, controlling the flow of air was the difference between life and a suffocating and gas-filled death. Declan designed ventilation systems that saved lives. He drew plans for structures that existed only in his imagination and in the pages of his notebooks. Someday, he told Bridget on winter nights in their small Pennsylvania cabin, "We will build a house that borrows warmth from the mountain itself. The earth will heat us. We will burn a quarter of the wood and be twice as warm." Bridget had smiled at her husband's dreams. She had watched him sketch by candlelight, filling page after page with diagrams and calculations. She had not understood the science, but she had understood the man. Declan saw possibilities where others saw only rock. Then the mine collapsed. It happened on a March morning in 1890, 18 months before Bridget would stand at the entrance of the Silver Crown mine and begin to build. A support timber failed without warning. The ceiling came down in a roar of stone and dust that could be heard in town 3 miles away. 14 men were trapped below. Declan was not among them. He was on the surface that morning, scheduled for a later shift. When the collapse happened, he did not hesitate. He did not wait for the company engineers. He organized the rescue himself. He designed a ventilation system on the spot, sketching it in the dirt with a stick, directing the digging crews to implement it. For 19 hours straight, he worked without rest, pumping breathable air to the trapped men through improvised channels of canvas and timber. 13 of the 14 survived. They emerged from the earth blinking and weeping, and they owed their lives to Declan Callahan's understanding of how air moves through stone. 3 weeks later, a second collapse took the rest of the unstable tunnel. Declan was underground when it happened. There was no one to design a rescue for him. There was no one who understood the earth the way he did. The company men dug for 4 days before they found his body, still clutching a notebook that had been in his pocket when the ceiling came down. Bridget cleaned that notebook as best she could. She read every page, though she understood perhaps 1 word in 10. The pages were stained with rock dust and something darker, something she chose not to think about. And in those pages, she found his dream. Diagrams of a cabin built inside a mine. Calculations showing how the stable temperature of the deep earth could be harnessed. Which were notes on air gaps and thermal mass and serpentine stovepipes that captured heat instead of wasting it up the chimney. Declan had never built his dream. He had died with it still on paper, still in his imagination. But he had left the notebook to his wife. And Bridget Callahan had decided that she would build it for him. The Silver Crown mine was not chosen at random. Bridget spent 3 weeks surveying every abandoned mine within 20 miles of the valley before she found what she was looking for. She walked into dark tunnels with a lantern and a measuring tape, checking for stability, checking for water seepage, checking for the specific features that Declan's notebook required. The Silver Crown had everything. Its entrance faced south, granting maximum exposure to the low winter sun. The main chamber was a stable dome of granite, roughly 45 feet deep and 35 feet wide, with a dry and solid floor that showed no signs of water damage. The rock was sound. The ceiling was high. And most importantly, Bridget found what she had been searching for: a narrow fissure in the rock, a natural chimney that snaked its way up through 60 feet of stone to emerge on the hillside above. It was exactly what Declan had drawn. It was exactly what his calculations required. She stood in that granite chamber with her son beside her and her husband's dog at her feet. She held the notebook open to a page she had studied 100 times. In Declan's careful handwriting, surrounded by diagrams and numbers, were the words that would guide everything she built. The mountain is a battery. Charge it with heat. Let it warm you through the winter. Build the cabin inside the cave, but not against the walls. Leave a gap. Let the air circulate. The earth will do the rest. Copper, the dog, sniffed at the stone floor and then settled onto a flat rock near the entrance. His ears pricked, his eyes alert. He had been Declan's dog before he was hers. Declan had found him as a puppy, abandoned in a mining tunnel, and had carried him out in the pocket of his coat. The dog had never left his side. Now Copper followed Bridget. He watched over Cormac. He slept at the foot of their bed and growled softly when strangers approached. He was the last living connection to the man they had both loved, and Bridget sometimes found herself talking to the dog as if Declan could hear her through him. "We are going to build it," she said quietly, her voice echoing in the chamber, "just like he planned." Head Cormac looked up at his mother with his father's eyes. "Will it really keep us warm, Ma?" "It will," she said. "Your father knew how. He wrote it all down for us." The boy considered this. Then he nodded, picked up a plank that was far too heavy for him, and began to drag it toward where his mother was standing. Bridget watched her son for a moment. Something fierce and tender moved through her chest. Then she shouldered her own burden and began to work. The construction took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of hauling lumber up a steep slope. 6 weeks of measuring and cutting and fitting joints by lantern light. 6 weeks of building something that no one in Montana had ever seen, while the townspeople below watched and whispered and waited for her to fail. Inside the main chamber of the Silver Crown mine, Bridget constructed a cabin, but not the kind of cabin anyone would have expected. She did not build it against the rock walls. This was the key insight from Declan's notebook, the element that made everything else work. Instead, she built a freestanding timber structure in the center of the chamber, leaving a continuous gap of 3 feet on all sides. 3 feet between the cabin walls and the granite, 3 feet above the roof and the stone ceiling, 3 feet all around, creating what Declan had called an air jacket. The gap was the most important part of the design. Without it, nothing else would function. The townspeople who heard about the construction assumed she was lining the mine walls with wood, creating a kind of cave house pressed against the stone. This would indeed have been foolish. Granite absorbs cold. A cabin built against frozen rock would be an ice house, just as the skeptics predicted. But the reality was far more sophisticated than anyone imagined. Bridget was creating a separate, sealed environment inside the mine. The cabin would float within the chamber like a ship in a bottle, buffered from the mountain's chill by a thick blanket of trapped air. The lumber was rough-cut Douglas fir, hauled from a sawmill 20 miles to the south. She chose it for its density and its tight grain. She assembled the frame with mortise and tenon joints, reinforced with iron brackets at the stress points. The walls were double thick, with a 2-inch air gap between the inner and outer boards. The floor was raised 6 inches off the stone, supported by short posts, creating a crawl space that would allow air to circulate beneath as well as around the structure. She laid the planks tight and caulked the gaps with a mixture of pine tar and sawdust. The ceiling was similarly constructed, boards covered with canvas, and then a second layer of thin planks. But the true genius of the design was in the stove and its pipe. The stove itself was nothing special. A small cast-iron box stove, rated for a single room, nowhere near powerful enough to heat a conventional cabin through a Montana winter. The hardware dealer in Helena had tried to talk her into something larger. That little thing would not keep a chicken warm in January, he had said. She had bought it anyway. The stovepipe was something else entirely. Conventional chimneys rise straight up, heat the smoke, create a draft, pull the exhaust skyward. It is efficient for removing smoke, but terribly inefficient for heating a home. Most of the thermal energy goes straight out the top of the chimney and into the sky, wasted. Declan's design turned this principle on its head. Bridget installed the stovepipe so that it exited the back wall of the cabin, not through the roof but horizontally, into the 3-foot air gap. There it began a long serpentine journey. It snaked back and forth across the gap, running along the far wall, then doubling back, then climbing at a gentle angle along the rock ceiling. In total, the pipe traveled 87 feet before it finally connected to the natural fissure that led to the open air above. 87 feet of cast iron pipe exposed to the air gap on all sides. This was the heat exchanger. This was the radiator. As hot exhaust gases traveled through the pipe, they would shed their thermal energy into the contained atmosphere of the air jacket. Energy that would otherwise be lost up a conventional chimney would instead be captured and held within the gap. And that warm air would do something remarkable. It would heat the granite walls of the mine chamber. Granite is dense. It heats slowly, but once heated, it retains that energy for a very long time. It has immense thermal mass, like a giant stone battery. This was the core of Declan's design. The stove would heat the pipe would heat the air gap would heat the granite, and the granite, saturated with warmth, would radiate that heat steadily back into the space. After a week of continuous heating, the entire system would stabilize. The rock walls would maintain a temperature well above freezing, regardless of conditions outside. The cabin would not be fighting the cold. It would be floating in a bubble of warmth created by the thermal battery of the mountain itself. There was one more element to the design that drew the most confusion from anyone who saw it. A 4-inch pipe ran from the base of the stove, under the cabin floor, through the crawl space, and out toward the mine entrance. This was a dedicated air intake, drawing oxygen for the fire directly from outside. The stove would not breathe the cabin's air. It would not create a draft that sucked warmth from the living space. The fire would be completely isolated from the environment it heated. When the system was complete, Bridget stood in the center of her cabin and looked around at what she had built. It was small but solid. One main room, perhaps 18 feet by 16, with a sleeping alcove partitioned by a curtain, a wood stove, a table and 2 chairs, a rope bed for herself and a smaller one for Cormac, hooks for coats and shelves for supplies. A single window in the door, fitted with thick glass she had carried up the mountain wrapped in quilts. Copper lay on a braided rug in the center of the floor, watching her with patient eyes. "We did it," she said quietly to the dog, to the empty room, to the ghost of her husband who seemed to hover in every corner. "We built what you dreamed." Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. The confrontation came 3 weeks into construction, when the shape of what Bridget was building became clear enough for the town's experts to understand. Garrett Holloway climbed the slope to the Silver Crown mine on a crisp October afternoon. He was 58 years old, built like a barrel, with a white beard that spread across his chest and hands like gnarled oak burls. He had buried his wife 5 years prior and had since devoted himself to 2 things: his grandchildren and his reputation as the finest builder in 4 counties. His nephew Theodore came with him, a lanky 17-year-old with curious eyes who had been asking questions about the widow's project for days. Holloway found Bridget fitting sections of the serpentine stovepipe, threading them through brackets she had mounted in the air gap. He watched for a long time in silence, his experienced eyes tracing the path of the metal through the shadows. He saw the horizontal runs. He saw the gentle bends. He saw the impossible length of pipe snaking through the darkness. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Callahan." Bridget did not stop working. "That is not a chimney," Holloway said. His voice echoed in the chamber. "That is a death trap." Bridget continued fitting the pipe. Holloway stepped closer, his boots crunching on loose stone. "I have told you before, and I will tell you again. You are running that pipe nearly 100 feet, most of it sideways. The smoke will cool before it ever leaves. Creosote will build up in those horizontal runs like black tar. First deep cold snap, you will light a hot fire, and that pipe will turn into a cannon. It will burn you and your boy alive in this hole." His voice carried no malice. He was presenting facts as he understood them. The accumulated wisdom of 35 years building in this climate. It will draw, Bridget said quietly. The fissure is high. The draft will be steady. Holloway's gaze swept the cavern. He pointed a thick finger at the glistening rock wall. And this granite, he continued, you think stone will keep you warm? This rock holds the cold, woman? It will be like living inside an ice house. The damp will get into everything. Your walls will weep with moisture all winter. You will have mold sickness in a month. This rock will suck the heat out of that little stove faster than you can feed it. Bridget looked at the granite. She looked back at Holloway. Her reply was quiet, almost gentle. I am not trying to warm the mountain, Mr. Holloway. I am asking the mountain to warm me. Holloway stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue. And the stove will not be breathing our air, she continued. Annoyed, she pointed to the small pipe running beneath the floor toward the mine entrance. Dedicated intake. The fire draws oxygen from outside. The cabin stays sealed. Holloway followed her pointing finger. He saw the pipe. He did not understand what it meant. Beside him, young Theodore leaned forward, his eyes bright with sudden interest. That is clever, he said quietly. If the fire does not draw cabin air, there is no draft pulling warm air out. The heat stays inside. Holloway turned on his nephew with a look that could have frozen water. Do not encourage this madness. He turned back to Bridget. His voice hardened. I have warned you. I have told you exactly what will happen. When you come crawling down this mountain in January, frozen and sick and begging for help, remember that I tried to save you. He turned and walked out of the mine, his footsteps echoing off the granite. Theodore lingered for a moment. He looked at the serpentine pipe, at the air gap, at the careful construction taking shape in the shadows. His uncle built cabins the same way everyone built cabins, the way his father had built them, the way his grandfather had built them. But this was something different. This was something he had never seen. Mrs. Callahan, he said quietly, I would like to understand how this works. May I come back? Bridget studied the boy's face. She saw genuine curiosity there. She saw something that reminded her of Declan, that same hunger to understand how things worked beneath the surface. Ask your uncle, she said. I am asking you. She almost smiled. Come back when he is not watching. I will show you the notebook. Theodore nodded. Then he hurried after his uncle, disappearing into the autumn light. Bridget turned back to her work. She had 3 weeks until winter arrived in earnest. 3 weeks to finish what she had started. She would not waste a single hour. The cabin was finished on the 2nd of November. From outside the mine entrance, there was almost nothing to see. Just a simple wooden door set back in the shadows, and higher up on the hillside, the barely visible opening of the natural fissure that would serve as her chimney. No smoke rose from the stone in those early days. The stove was not yet lit. The granite had not yet been charged with heat. Inside, the structure was complete and waiting. Bridget lit the stove for the first time on November 3rd. The fire caught slowly, drawing air through the dedicated intake pipe. Smoke rose, entered the serpentine length of stovepipe, and began its 87-foot journey through the air gap. Bridget stood outside in the cold morning air, watching the natural fissure high above. For several minutes, nothing emerged. Then faintly, a thin wisp of gray smoke appeared against the sky. The draft had established itself. The system was drawing. Now came the waiting. For 5 straight days, Bridget kept the fire burning at a moderate temperature. She was not trying to heat the cabin. She was trying to heat the granite. The first day, the rock walls felt cold to the touch. By the 3rd day, they felt merely cool. By the 5th day, when she pressed her palm against the stone nearest the ceiling of the air gap, she felt something that made her breath catch in her throat. Warmth, not hot, not like a surface heated by direct flame, but distinctly, and unmistakably warmer than the air around it. The thermal mass was charging. The mountain was absorbing the heat that the serpentine pipe radiated into the air gap, and that heat was spreading through the stone like water soaking into a sponge. Bridget opened Declan's notebook and made her first entry beneath his final calculations. November 8, 1891. Rock temperature at ceiling level approximately 58 degrees. Air temperature in cabin 64 degrees with fire banked low. System appears to be functioning as designed. She read the entry twice. Then she added one more line in her own hand. I wish you could see this. If you are enjoying this story so far, I would like to ask you to do something simple. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already, and click the notification bell so you will know when new stories are posted. And then we are about to enter the most dangerous part of Bridget Callahan's journey, and I want you to be here to see what happens next. The first test came in mid-November. A cold snap swept down from Canada, dropping temperatures across the territory. In Elkhorn Valley, the mercury fell to 15 degrees below zero and stayed there for 3 days. The wind blew steady from the north, stripping heat from every surface it touched. In the town below, chimneys smoked furiously. The sound of axes splitting wood rang through the crisp air as families fed their hungry fires. Garrett Holloway's cabin, the finest in the valley, consumed a quarter cord of wood each day. Even so, he and his grandchildren wore heavy sweaters indoors, and frost formed on the window panes despite the roaring fire. In the Silver Crown mine, Bridget Callahan kept her small stove burning at barely above a simmer. The temperature inside the cabin held at 68 degrees. She used 1/8 of a cord in 3 days. The granite walls, now fully charged with heat, radiated a gentle warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. The air in the gap circulated slowly, carrying heat from the serpentine pipe to the stone and back again. The system had achieved equilibrium. Cormac played barefoot on the rag rug in the center of the room, rolling a ball of rags for Copper to chase. The dog's tail thumped against the floor with each toss. Bridget sat at her table, mending clothes by lamplight, warm enough to roll up her sleeves. Outside, the cold tried to kill everything it touched. Inside, it might as well have been spring. But no one from the valley climbed the slope to see. The skeptics had already made their judgments. They would simply wait for reality to prove them right. There was one visitor during that November cold snap. Theodore Holloway came at dusk on the second day when he was certain his uncle would not miss him. He climbed the frozen slope with his collar turned up against the wind, his boots crunching through the crust of old snow. He knocked on the wooden door. Bridget opened it, and the wave of warmth that struck Theodore was like stepping from winter into summer. His breath, which had been fogging in the frigid air, suddenly cleared. The tension in his shoulders released. He had not realized how cold he was until he felt what warm truly meant. He stepped inside at Bridget's gesture and stood in the center of the cabin, turning slowly, taking in every detail. The small stove with its lazy fire, the dry walls, the comfortable temperature that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His uncle had told him this was impossible. His uncle had spent 52 cabins worth of certainty insisting that this could not work. And yet here he stood, warm for the first time in days, in a cabin that burned less wood than his uncle's chicken coop. "How?" he asked. Bridget closed the door behind him. She walked to the table and picked up the leather notebook. "Sit down," she said. "I will show you." For the next 2 hours, she walked him through the principles. She showed him Declan's drawings, his calculations, his observations from years in the copper mines. She explained thermal mass in terms a frontier boy could understand. "Think of a stone left in the sun all day," she said. "At night, when the air grows cold, and the stone is still warm, it releases its heat slowly over hours. Now imagine that stone is the entire mountain. Imagine charging it with heat all winter long. It becomes a battery that never runs out." Theodore listened with the intensity of someone whose world was expanding before his eyes. He asked questions. Bridget answered them. When he did not understand something, she explained it a different way. When he finally left, the cold hitting him like a slap after the warmth of the cabin, he carried knowledge in his head that would change the trajectory of his entire life. But he did not tell his uncle. Garrett Holloway would not have listened. And Theodore had learned something else that evening. He had learned that sometimes the wisest thing to do is wait. Wait until the proof is so overwhelming that even the most stubborn man cannot deny it. The proof would come soon enough. December came to Montana territory like a held breath. The first 2 weeks were deceptively mild. Temperatures hovered in the 20s, cold but manageable. Snow fell gently, accumulating in soft drifts that made the valley look peaceful and clean. The townspeople relaxed slightly. Perhaps this would not be such a hard winter after all. Old Seamus Rafferty knew better. He was 78 years old, Irish like Bridget, a former miner who had worked the copper pits of Butte before his lungs gave out. He walked with a cane now and breathed with a whistle, but his eyes were sharp and his memory was long. He stood outside his small cabin on December 14th, watching the sky with worried eyes. The air had an odd quality to it, a heaviness, a stillness. The pressure was changing in ways his old bones could feel. High cirrus clouds streaked the western horizon, and they had a particular curl to them that he had seen only once before in his life. The winter of '62, he murmured to himself, before the territory was even a territory, before there were towns here at all. He remembered that winter. He had been working the mines in Butte then, a young man still strong in his lungs. The cold had come without warning. 16 men had died in a single night, caught outside without shelter when the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 6 hours. He looked toward the slope of the mountain where the silver-crowned mine made a dark scar against the white. God protect them, he said quietly. God protect us all. That night, the animals began to behave strangely. Dogs howled without cause. Horses stamped and snorted in their stables. A flock of ravens that had been roosting in the cottonwoods along the creek suddenly took flight, wheeling east in a dark cloud, fleeing something that only they could sense. At dawn on December 17th, the sky was the color of a dull pewter bowl. There was no wind, not a whisper. The absolute stillness was more frightening than any storm. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to arrive. At 6 in the morning, the temperature in Elkhorn Valley was 5 degrees below zero. Cold, but not unusual. By noon, it had fallen to 20 below. By sunset, it was 35 below. And then the wind came. It came from the north like a living thing, a shrieking, howling monster that slammed into the valley with the force of a physical blow. It was not a gust. It was not a squall. It was a sustained assault, a continuous roar of frozen air moving at 60 miles per hour, and it did not stop. The settlers had a name for this kind of wind. They called it the barber because it shaved the warmth from a man's bones. But this was worse than any barber they had known. This was something else entirely. This was death itself, given form and voice and terrible purpose. In the days to come, when they spoke of it at all, they would call it the devil's breath. By midnight, the temperature had fallen to 47 degrees below zero. With the wind chill, the effective temperature was somewhere around 70 below. At those temperatures, exposed flesh freezes in under 3 minutes. Our spit crackles into ice before it hits the ground. Metal becomes brittle enough to shatter. The moisture in your lungs crystallizes with every breath, and each inhalation feels like swallowing broken glass. In the valley below, the killing began. The first to die was old Peterson, a trapper who lived alone in a lean-to shelter 3 miles from town. He was 71 years old and had survived 40 Montana winters through stubbornness and skill. He went out to fetch wood from his pile at dawn on the second day. The pile was 15 feet from his door. In the whiteout conditions of blowing snow, he lost his bearings. They found him 3 months later when the snow melted. He had frozen solid 9 feet from his own threshold. The livestock died in droves. Cattle that had survived previous winters, huddled together in barns and lean-tos, was succumbed by the dozens. Their water troughs froze solid. Their bodies could not generate enough heat to survive the relentless cold. By the third day, more than 300 cattle had perished across the valley, 89 horses, uncounted chickens and pigs and goats. The settlers retreated into their cabins and began the grim calculus of survival. Garrett Holloway's cabin, the finest in the valley, was failing. He had built it with thick squared logs, perfectly chinked, with a massive stone fireplace at one end. He had built it to withstand anything Montana could throw at it, and for 35 years it had. But this was something beyond anything it had been built for. The fireplace roared with seasoned oak, consuming wood at a rate Holloway had never seen. He fed it every 2 hours around the clock, and still the cold pressed in. He could feel it coming through the walls, through the floor, through the very stones of his fireplace. The warm air rose and was sucked up the chimney, creating a draft that pulled frigid air in through every tiny gap. Ice crystals spread across the interior walls like white mold, tracing every gap, every weakness, every place where the cold was winning. His granddaughter Molly, 4 years old, had developed a cough that worried him deeply, a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the too cold air. She huddled near the fire, wrapped in every blanket he owned, and still she shivered. By the fourth day, the temperature inside Holloway's cabin had fallen to 38 degrees despite the constant fire. His woodpile was half gone. He had laid in what he thought was more than enough for the entire winter. At this rate, it would be gone by Christmas, and there was no cutting more. The trees themselves were frozen solid, their trunks hard as iron, their branches shattering like glass when struck. In the darkness of the Silver Crown mine, a different reality existed. Bridget Callahan sat at her table, reading by lamplight. She wore a light cotton dress and an apron. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. Beside her, Cormac lay on the rag rug with Copper, the two of them playing some game involving string that only they understood. The boy was in his stocking feet. The dog's tail thumped contentedly against the floor. The stove burned low, a gentle orange glow behind the iron door. The temperature inside the cabin was 71 degrees Fahrenheit. The granite walls radiated their stored heat with patient constancy. The air in the gap circulated slowly, now carrying warmth from the serpentine pipe, redistributing it evenly throughout the chamber. The system that Declan had designed, that Bridget had built, that Garrett Holloway had called impossible, was working exactly as intended. Outside the wooden door in the mine entrance, the temperature was 46 degrees, cold enough to require a coat, but nowhere near deadly. Beyond the mine entrance, the devil's breath howled and murdered. Bridget was aware of the storm. She could hear it, a distant roaring like a waterfall heard through stone walls. But the cold itself could not reach her. The mountains stood between her family and death. She thought about the people in the valley below. She thought about Garrett Holloway, who had tried to warn her, who had been so certain of his own rightness. She thought about the children huddled around inadequate fires, shivering through nights that seemed to have no end. She did not hate them. She did not even resent the mockery, but she did not go down to help them either. Not yet. The sixth night of the Devil's Breath was the longest. In a cabin half a mile from the center of town, a young woman named Linnea Bergstrom was watching her children die. She was 32 years old, Swedish by birth, widowed for 2 years. She had 2 children, a boy of 5 named Anders, and a girl of 3 named Maya. Her cabin was small and poorly built, purchased cheaply from a family that had given up and gone back east. She had known it was not adequate for a harsh winter. She had planned to improve it in the spring. Spring seemed very far away now. The fire in her stove had gone out at midnight when the last of her wood was consumed. She had burned the chairs. She had burned the table. She had broken up the bed frame and fed it to the flames. And now there was nothing left to burn but the walls themselves, and she was not strong enough to tear them down. The temperature in the cabin was below freezing and falling. Her son Anders lay in one corner, wrapped in every scrap of cloth Linnea owned. His lips were blue. His breathing was shallow. Her daughter Maya lay beside him, silent and still. Linnea knew the signs. She had seen them in Sweden, in the terrible winter of her childhood. She knew that children died quietly when the cold took them. They simply stopped. She had perhaps 2 hours before that happened, and in that desperate darkness, with the wind screaming outside and death closing in, Linnea thought of the madwoman on the mountain. She had heard the stories. Everyone in the valley had heard them. The widow Callahan building a cabin inside a mine, claiming she could stay warm without wood. Madness, folly, suicide. But Linnea was past the point of caring about madness. She wrapped her children in the blankets. She gathered them into her arms, her son over one shoulder, her daughter clutched to her chest. She was not strong enough to carry them both for long. She knew this, but she also knew that if she left either one behind, they would be dead before she could return. She opened the door. The cold hit her like a physical assault. It drove the breath from her lungs. It bit into her exposed skin with teeth of ice. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Why she could not see more than 5 feet in any direction. The blowing snow created a perfect whiteout, a world of swirling white that had no up or down, no left or right. But she knew which way the mountain was. She had looked at it every day for 2 years, that dark slope rising above the valley. She knew it was 400 yards away, 400 yards through the Devil's Breath. She began to walk. Linnea Bergstrom should have died that night. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 400 yards, 47 below zero, 60-mile-per-hour winds, two children in her arms, no clear path, no landmarks, nothing but white screaming darkness in every direction. She should have lost her way within 50 yards. She should have collapsed within 100. She should have frozen solid, a monument to desperate hope, to be found in the spring like old Peterson. But something kept her moving. Later, she would say it was God. Others would say it was luck, or the particular angle of the wind that night, or the faint glow of lamplight from the mine entrance that reached her eyes at the exact moment she was about to fall. Whatever it was, Linnea Bergstrom stumbled into the entrance of the Silver Crown mine with her children still breathing in her arms. She could not feel her hands. She could not feel her face. Her eyelashes were frozen together, and she had to pry them apart with fingers that would not obey her. But she had found the door. She beat upon it with numb fists. She could not tell if she was making any sound. The wind swallowed everything. Then the door opened. Light and warmth poured out like water from a broken dam. Bridget Callahan stood in the doorway, backlit by lamplight, her face shifting from surprise to concern in half a heartbeat. She reached out and pulled Linnea inside. The warmth was overwhelming. Linnea collapsed on the floor just inside the door, her children spilling from her arms. She was gasping, sobbing, her body beginning to shake as the cold released its grip and sensation returned. It was agony. The warming of frozen flesh is not gentle. It burns. The blood returning to extremities that have been denied, it feels like fire in the veins. But it was agony that meant life. Bridget moved with swift efficiency. She pulled the children closer to the stove, checking their breathing, their pulses. Anders was in worse shape than Maya. His lips were blue, his skin waxy, but he was alive. "Cormac," she said sharply. "Hot water." And then the blankets from the chest. Her son obeyed instantly, moving to help. Copper circled the newcomers, whimpering softly, then pressed his warm body against little Maya. For the next hour, Bridget worked to save 3 lives. She wrapped them in warmed blankets. She fed them sips of hot water, then tea, then broth. She massaged their hands and feet, restoring circulation gradually, minimizing the damage to frozen tissue. She spoke to them constantly, a low, soothing stream of words that meant nothing except, "You are safe now. You are warm. You will live." And through it all, Linnea Bergstrom stared at her surroundings with eyes that could not believe what they were seeing. The cabin was warm, not just tolerable, not just survivable. Warm, like a summer afternoon, like a dream of safety in the depths of hell. "How?" She whispered when she could finally speak. "Garrett Holloway said you would die in this cave. He said the cold would kill you." Bridget handed her another cup of hot tea. "Garrett Holloway," she said quietly, "does not know everything." By morning, the storm had not abated, but the crisis in the cabin had passed. Anders and Maya slept curled together on a pallet near the stove, their color restored, their breathing peaceful. They would remember nothing of the journey through the storm, but they would grow up knowing that a stranger had saved their lives. Linnea herself sat at Bridget's table, wrapped in blankets, her hands curled around a cup of tea, staring at the thermometer on the wall. 73 degrees. The number seemed impossible. Outside, people were dying. Warren, the entire valley was locked in a battle for survival against cold so extreme it defied comprehension. And here, inside a mine shaft, in a cabin built by a widow with nothing but a dead man's notebook, the air was 73 degrees. "How much wood have you burned?" Linnea asked. Bridget considered the question. Perhaps a quarter cord since the storm began. A bit more at the start to heat the rock. Less now. A quarter cord. Linnea closed her eyes. She had burned everything in her cabin. Her furniture, her bed, everything. And it had not been enough. This woman had burned a quarter cord and was sitting in her shirt sleeves. "My children would have died," Linnea said. Her voice cracked. "They would have died, and Garrett Holloway would have shaken his head and said, 'What a shame.' And he never would have known that there was a place they could have been safe. A place he told us was a tomb." Bridget was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke. "When the storm ends," she said, "they will know. This story is almost at its climax, and I do not want you to miss what happens next. If you have not already, hit that like button right now. It only takes a second, but it helps more people find these stories. And trust me, you are going to want to see how this ends. The storm did not end. Day 7, Day 8. The devil's breath continued its assault, and the death toll continued to rise. On the 7th day, young Theodore Holloway appeared at the mine entrance, half frozen, having slipped away from his uncle's house and made the climb through the storm. He had not been able to stop thinking about the warm cabin, and about the principles Bridget had shown him, about the certainty in his uncle's voice, and the equal certainty that his uncle was wrong. He stumbled through the door and found himself in a room that now held 6 people, a dog, and warmth that felt like a miracle. "Your uncle does not know you are here," Bridget said. Theodore shook his head, too cold to speak. Bridget handed him a blanket and pointed him toward the stove. "He will know soon enough," she said. On the 10th day, old Seamus Rafferty arrived, climbing the slope with his cane, moving through the storm with the determination of a man who had survived worse and refused to die now. "I knew," he said to Bridget as she helped him through the door. His breath was ragged, his face white with cold, but his eyes were bright. "When I first saw what you were building, I knew it would work." Bridget helped him to a chair near the stove. "You never told anyone." "Who would have listened?" Seamus replied. His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was no bitterness in it, just acceptance. They had already made up their minds. A widow, a foreigner, a woman. "They decided you were mad before you drove the first nail." He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were thin and cold, but his grip was strong. "My grandfather built something similar in Cornwall," he said, "in the tin mines. He lived to be 93 years old, and he never spent a winter cold." He looked around the cabin at the refugees who had gathered there. Linnea and her children, Theodore, the others who had trickled in as word spread through the desperate network of survivors. "I am glad I lived long enough to see it proven," he said. 23 people survived the devil's breath in the Silver Crown mine. They came one by one and in small groups, those who had heard the rumors, those who had grown desperate enough to try anything, those who had been saved by the sight of lamplight glowing from a mine entrance on the darkest of nights. The Decker family arrived on the 8th day, after a section of their store's roof collapsed under the weight of snow. They brought what food they could carry in the shame of men who had doubted. Dr. Ezra Whitfield came on the 9th day, supported by his wife, having finally admitted that his own well-built home was failing. He had been one of those who questioned Bridget's sanity at the church meeting. He entered her cabin and could not speak for nearly an hour. They slept in shifts, sharing blankets and floor space. They ate from Bridget's stores, supplemented by what the refugees had brought. They talked quietly, played cards, told stories, and tried not to think about what was happening outside. The children adapted fastest, as children always do. Cormac became a tour guide of sorts, explaining the cabin to newcomers, showing them how the stove worked, pointing out the serpentine pipe visible through the air gap. His father designed it, he told anyone who would listen. He wrote it all down in a book, and my ma built it just like he said. The mountain keeps us warm. Copper moved among the refugees like a four-legged ambassador, offering comfort to crying children and silent adults alike. The dog seemed to understand that his duty had expanded. And still the storm raged, and still Garrett Holloway did not come. On the 8th night of the storm, Garrett Holloway's granddaughter stopped eating. The child lay in her bed, wrapped in every blanket he owned, her small body shaking with chills despite the fire that Holloway fed constantly. Her cough had worsened into something wet and rattling. Her breathing had become labored, and now she would not eat, would not drink, would only stare at the ceiling with glassy eyes. Holloway had built 52 cabins. He had buried his wife. He had raised his children and watched his grandchildren come into the world. He had faced blizzards and droughts and all the hardships the frontier could offer. But he had never felt so helpless as he did watching that child slip away. His daughter-in-law Martha pressed wet cloths to the girl's forehead and said nothing, but her eyes spoke volumes. "She needs warmth," Martha said finally. "Real warmth. A constant warmth. Her body cannot fight the fever if it is also fighting the cold." Holloway looked at his fireplace, roaring with flames that consumed wood faster than he could feed it. "I am doing everything I can," he said. "I know," Martha replied. It is not enough. That evening, as darkness fell for the 8th time, Garrett Holloway stood at his window and looked up toward the mountain he could not see. The Silver Crown mine was invisible in the whiteout, but he knew it was there. He knew the widow was there. He had heard through the desperate chain of communication that still existed between survivors that people had made it to the mine, that they were alive, that somehow, impossibly, they were warm. He had not believed it at first. He had told himself it was rumor, the kind of desperate hope that people cling to when everything else has failed. But Theodore was gone. His nephew had slipped away days ago, and Holloway knew where he had gone. Theodore had been asking about the widow's cabin for months. Theodore had been questioning everything Holloway had taught him about building. And now Theodore was somewhere on that mountain, either dead in the snow or alive in a place that should not exist. Holloway looked at his granddaughter. He looked at the fire that could not warm her. He looked at the ice spreading across his walls like a disease, and he made his decision. The journey nearly killed him. He wrapped his granddaughter Molly in every blanket he could find. He layered clothes over his own body until he could barely move. He told Martha to keep the fire burning, to wait for him, to pray. And then he stepped out into the devil's breath and began to climb. 400 yards, the same distance Linnea had traveled. But Holloway was 58 years old and his joints ached with the cold, and he carried a dying child in his arms. The journey was everything Linnea's had been, and worse. He was older. He was slower. The child in his arms grew heavier with every step. But he had something Linnea had not possessed. He had the weight of his own pride driving him forward. The knowledge that everything he had believed was wrong, and the desperate need to prove that he could learn from his mistakes. His hands went numb first, then his feet, then his face. The cold was eating him alive, cell by cell. But he did not stop. He thought about every cabin he had ever built. He thought about his wife, dead 5 years, and how much he still missed her. He thought about his granddaughter dying in his arms. He thought about Bridget Callahan and how he had called her a fool, and how he had tried to convince the town that she was mad with grief, and how she had looked at him with those quiet eyes and said nothing. "I was wrong," he whispered into the wind. The words froze on his lips. "I was wrong about everything." The slope seemed to go on forever. Each step was a battle. Each breath was agony. And then, impossibly, he was there. His frozen hand struck wood. A door. He had found the door. He tried to knock, but his hands would not obey. He slumped against the wood, still clutching his granddaughter, and waited for the end. The door opened. Light and warmth poured out, and Garrett Holloway fell into the arms of the woman he had called a fool. He saw her first as a blur of movement and light, strong arms catching him as he fell. Voices calling out, hands taking the child from his frozen grip. He lay on the floor of the cabin, gasping, his body beginning to shake as the warmth penetrated his frozen limbs. The pain was extraordinary, every nerve screaming as blood forced its way back into tissue that had been denied it. But even through the agony, even through the fog of exhaustion and cold, Garrett Holloway was aware. He was aware of the temperature. The floor beneath him was warm, not just room temperature, warm, like sun-soaked stone on a summer afternoon. He forced himself to look around. 22 people filled the small cabin, faces he recognized from the valley, children playing on a rug, adults sitting against the walls. His own nephew Theodore, kneeling beside him with tears in his eyes. And warmth. Warmth everywhere. Warmth that should not exist. The thermometer on the wall read 73 degrees. Garrett Holloway stared at that number for a long time. Then he turned his head and found Bridget Callahan watching him. She stood near the stove, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. He tried to speak. His lips were too frozen to form words properly. She seemed to understand anyway. "Your granddaughter is being warmed," she said quietly. "Linnea is caring for her. She will live." Holloway closed his eyes. Something released inside his chest. Something he had been holding on to for days, or maybe for years. He had been wrong. Not just slightly wrong. Not wrong in a way that could be chalked up to unusual circumstances. He had been fundamentally, completely, utterly wrong about something he claimed to understand better than anyone. This woman had known. She had tried to tell him, and he had threatened her. He had tried to convince the town that she was mad, and now she had saved his granddaughter's life. The storm ended on the 11th day. The wind died at dawn as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was almost shocking after so many days of constant roar. The survivors emerged from the mine, blinking in the pale winter light, to see a world transformed. Snow piled in drifts taller than houses, a sky scrubbed clean to a hard blue. The temperature still brutal, but without the wind almost bearable, and damage visible everywhere. From the mine entrance, they could see collapsed roofs in the valley below, dark shapes of dead cattle scattered across the fields, smoke rising from fewer chimneys than there should have been. 7 dead, they would learn. 7 human beings who had not been fast enough or lucky enough to find shelter. Old Peterson, the Harper family. 2 travelers caught on the road, but 23 had survived in the Silver Crown mine. 23 people who would have died in their failing cabins had Bridget Callahan not built what everyone said was impossible. The reckoning came 2 days later. Nearly everyone who had survived the storm gathered in what remained of the community hall. Those who had sheltered in the mine, those who had weathered it in their own homes, those who had lost everything. Garrett Holloway asked to speak. He stood at the front of the room, his face still showing the marks of frostbite. His granddaughter Molly, healthy and whole in her mother's arms at the back of the hall. "Most of you know me," he began. His voice was rough. "I have lived in this valley for 35 years. I have built 52 cabins. I thought I knew this land. I thought I knew how to survive here." He paused. His eyes found Bridget's where she sat near the door. "I was wrong." The room went completely silent. When Mrs. Callahan came to this valley, she began building something I did not understand. I watched her haul lumber into an abandoned mine. I watched her construct a cabin in a cave. I saw her stovepipe running 90 feet through an air gap, and I told her it would kill her. He took a breath. "I told people she was mad. I said she was building a tomb. I stood in that church and suggested that her son should be taken away for his own safety." His voice cracked. 23 people survived the devil's breath in that mine. 23 people, including my own granddaughter, who would be dead right now if Mrs. Callahan had not taken her in. The woman I called a fool saved us. The tomb I mocked became the only safe place in the entire valley. He walked slowly to where Bridget sat and stood before her. "I was wrong," he said. "We were all wrong. I am sorry. I am sorry for what I said and what I tried to do. I am asking you, in front of everyone, to forgive me." The room held its breath. Bridget Callahan rose from her chair. She looked at this man who had threatened her family, who had been so certain of his own rightness that he could not see what was right in front of him. She extended her hand. "Teach me to build with wood," she said, "and I will teach you to build with stone." Honey Holloway stared at her hand. Then he took it. And in that handshake, something changed in Elkhorn Valley forever. If this story has moved you, I want to ask you to share it with someone who would appreciate it. A friend, a family member, someone who needs to hear that sometimes the quiet ones, the ones everyone doubts, turn out to be right. Share this story and pass it on. The spring of 1892 came late to Montana, but when it came, it brought change. Garrett Holloway spent that spring at the Silver Crown mine, learning everything Bridget could teach him. He studied Declan's notebook until he could recite the principles from memory. He asked questions, took notes, and slowly rebuilt his understanding of how heat and cold and shelter actually worked. Together, they designed what they called the Holloway-Callahan thermal cabin. It was not a mine dwelling. It was a regular cabin built on the surface, but incorporating the principles that Bridget had proven in the storm. Thick stone foundations extending below the frost line, double walls with air gaps that could be heated by ducted stovepipes, serpentine chimneys that captured heat instead of wasting it. The first of these new cabins was built that summer for Linnea Bergstrom, who had lost everything in the storm except her children and her life. When the following winter came, Linnea burned half the wood she had used in previous years and was twice as warm. Anders and Maya played in every room of the house, not just the small circle around the fire. By 1896, 34 structures in the region used the thermal principles Bridget had introduced. The death rate from winter cold dropped dramatically. Families that had once huddled around inadequate fires now lived comfortably throughout their homes. And Bridget never charged a single dollar for any of it. "The knowledge belongs to everyone," she said when people offered to pay. "It was my husband's gift to the world. I will not sell it." In the summer of 1898, Garrett Holloway came to the Silver Crown mine with something other than blueprints in his hand. He was 65 years old, his beard now entirely white, his step slower than it had been, but his eyes were clear and his voice was steady when he spoke. "Bridget," he said, standing in the entrance of her cabin while she worked at her table, "I have been a widower for 12 years. I have spent the last 7 of those years working beside you, learning from you, building with you. I have never met anyone like you." Bridget set down her pen and looked at him. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, "not because you need a husband. You have proven you need nothing from anyone. I am asking because I want to spend whatever years I have left in your company, because you made me a better man than I ever was before." For a long moment, Bridget was silent. Then she stood and walked to where he waited. "Garrett," she said gently, "you have become my dearest friend, my partner, my equal in everything that matters. But I had one great love in my life. Declan gave me everything, including the knowledge that built this place. I do not need another husband." She took his hand. "But I could use a good builder. Stay, work with me, be my partner in everything but name. That is what I can offer you." Holloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "That is enough." "Sure," he said. "That is more than enough." They never married, but they never parted either. For the next 10 years, until Holloway's death in 1908, they worked side by side, building structures that changed how the valley survived. They argued about technique and agreed about principle. They shared meals and stories and the quiet comfort of two people who understood each other completely. It was not a romance in the traditional sense, but it was love, of a kind that perhaps matters more. Theodore Holloway became a different kind of legacy. The curious 17-year-old who had snuck up to the mine grew into a man obsessed with understanding. He apprenticed with his uncle and studied Bridget's notebooks. In 1897, he left Montana to pursue engineering at a college in the East. He returned in 1903, the year Copper died. And the old dog had lived to be 14, ancient for a working breed. He had spent his final years lying by the stove in the Silver Crown cabin, watching over Bridget and Cormac, with roomy eyes that still brightened when visitors arrived. He died on a November morning, quietly in his sleep. Bridget found him still and cold, curled in his favorite spot, and she wept for the first time since her husband's funeral. They buried him at the entrance to the mine, where he had kept watch for so many years. Theodore carved the headstone himself. "Copper, faithful guardian." He kept the warmth. Old Seamus Rafferty died the following spring, peacefully in his sleep. He was 79 years old. At his funeral, Bridget spoke about the importance of believing in things that others cannot see, and about the courage it takes to stay silent when speaking would only bring mockery. She did not mention that Seamus had been her first ally, but everyone who had been in the mine that winter understood. Garrett Holloway died in 1908 at 75. He had spent the last 16 years of his life as a different man. The experience in the mine had broken something in him, some wall of pride that had prevented him from seeing clearly. What grew in its place was humility, curiosity, and a willingness to learn. At his funeral, Bridget spoke. "Garrett Holloway tried to take my son from me," she said. "He was certain I was wrong, and he acted on that certainty." She paused. "But I learned something from Garrett that I never expected. The measure of a person is not whether they make mistakes. We all make mistakes. The measure is whether they can admit those mistakes and change. Garrett Holloway changed. And because he changed, this valley is warmer, safer, and better than it was." She placed her hand on his coffin. "Rest well, old friend. You kept your end of the bargain." Bridget Callahan died in 1924 at 67 years old. She never left the Silver Crown mine. The cabin she had built in 1891 remained her home until the end. Cormac grew up to become an engineer and moved to Butte. He visited often, bringing first a wife and later children of his own. Bridget told her grandchildren stories about their great-grandfather Declan. She showed them his notebook, now worn thin from decades of handling. She taught them to see the world the way he had seen it. The mountain is a battery, she told them. Never forget that. The earth has warmth to give, if you know how to ask for it. She died on March the 15th, a quiet death, peaceful, in the bed where she had slept for 33 years. The cabin was warm around her. The granite walls still radiated the heat they had stored. They buried her next to copper at the entrance to the mine. Cormac carved her headstone himself. Brigid Callahan, 1857 to 1924. She built what he dreamed. In 1958, a team of researchers from Montana State University came to investigate the site. They had found Theodore Holloway's journals, donated to the university library after his death in 1961. They had read his detailed descriptions of the thermal system that Brigid Callahan had built. They were skeptical. The principles were sound, but the efficiency described seemed impossibly high, so they built a reconstruction. Using Theodore's notes and Declan's original calculations, they constructed a scale model of the Callahan cabin inside a controlled environment. They subjected it to temperatures as low as 50 below zero. They measured everything. The results exceeded their expectations. The thermal mass system was 2.7 times more efficient than conventional construction of the same era. The serpentine stovepipe captured 73% of the heat that would otherwise have been lost. The stable earth temperature provided a baseline that reduced heating requirements by 40%. The principles that Declan Callahan had discovered in the copper mines of Pennsylvania, that Brigid had implemented alone on a Montana mountainside, were validated by modern science nearly 70 years later. And the lead researcher wrote in her report, the Callahan system anticipates by nearly 100 years the core principles of passive solar design, earth-sheltered construction, and heat recovery ventilation. It is a remarkable example of practical engineering emerging from direct observation. That it was designed by a self-educated miner and built by his widow, working alone with hand tools in one of the harshest climates in North America, makes it extraordinary. Theodore Holloway lived long enough to know his work had been validated. In 1958, 3 years before his death, he received a letter from the research team informing him that they had found his journals and intended to study the Callahan system. He wept when he read it. A reporter from the Butte newspaper interviewed him that same year. He was 84 years old, not confined to a wheelchair, but his mind was still sharp. He sat in his room at the nursing home, looking out at the mountains that had been his home for almost 90 years. My grandfather was the best builder in Montana, he said. He knew everything, or he thought he did. Then a widow from Ireland, with nothing but a dead husband's notebook and a stubborn heart, proved him wrong. The reporter asked what lesson he drew from that experience. Theodore was quiet for a long moment. The lesson is not that experts are always wrong, he said finally. The lesson is that sometimes the people who see the world differently see it more clearly. And the greatest wisdom is knowing when to stop talking and start listening. The story of Brigid Callahan is not taught in schools. There are no monuments to her. The Silver Crown mine is not marked on any tourist map, but her legacy endures. It endures in the structures still standing that use the thermal principles she introduced. It endures in the engineering concepts she pioneered before they had names. It endures in every modern home that uses earth-sheltered design or heat recovery ventilation. And it endures in the lessons she taught without ever meaning to teach it. That sometimes the quiet ones know something. That sometimes the outsiders see what the experts miss. That sometimes a widow with a notebook and a stubborn heart can save 23 lives and change the way an entire valley thinks about survival. The earth maintains a stable temperature below the frost line. Thermal mass can store and release heat over time. A clever person, paying attention, can borrow warmth from the mountain itself. Brigid Callahan understood these things not because she had degrees or certificates, but because she trusted her husband's observations and had the courage to act on them when everyone said she was wrong. Somewhere right now, someone is probably building something that the experts say cannot work. Maybe they are wrong, or maybe, like Brigid, they see something no one else can see. And maybe, like Brigid, they will change the world by proving that the impossible is possible after all. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it touched you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who saw things differently and turned out to be right, I hope you will share it. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications. Until next time, stay warm. And remember, sometimes the mountain has warmth to give if you know how to ask for it. The end.